The studio lights burned like white suns overhead, casting a sterile glow on the circular stage where two chairs faced each other like duelists. The air inside Family Truth carried a heavy, expectant silence, the kind that made every shift of fabric or click of a shoe echo like a gunshot. Viewers across the country leaned forward as the host announced the reunion the producers had promised for weeks. Ethan Monroe, the elusive young tech millionaire known as much for his brilliance as for his quiet dignity, would confront the woman who had abandoned him nearly 2 decades ago. His mother, Helena Ward, was about to step back into the life she had walked away from without looking over her shoulder. She entered from stage left as if carried by a wave of her own tears. Her thin frame trembled, shoulders shaking as she dabbed at her cheeks with a crumpled tissue. The studio gasped at her raw display of grief. "I had no choice," she said, voice cracking, hands clutching each other like she might disappear if she let go. Mason was violent. "I had to run or he would have killed me. I had to save myself." The words floated into the space between her and the son she had not seen since he was 5, hoping they might bridge the canyon she had carved through his childhood. But Ethan did not move. He sat straight-backed in his chair, tailored black suit cutting a sharp line beneath the blinding lights, the small rainbow pin on his lapel glinting like a blade. His face was calm, yet cold, his eyes a glacier's edge that refused to melt. He let her words settle and die on the studio floor. Then, with the measured precision of a surgeon making an incision, he spoke, "You don't get to call yourself my mother." The words were quiet but carried like thunder through the soundstage, slicing through the set's perfect air. The audience froze. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, as if they feared capturing the look in his eyes. Helena's crying faltered, confusion flashing behind her lashes before a new sharpness surfaced. She raised her chin, clinging to a final justification, and said she had not only returned for forgiveness, but also for what was rightfully hers, half of the compensation from the sale of their old house. She called it the fruit of her youth, her lost years, her sacrifice. The claim landed like a slap against stone. The host shifted uncomfortably, producers whispering behind the cameras. But no one dared break the tension. Ethan did not blink. His expression stayed carved from ice as the silence stretched so taut it seemed ready to tear. He finally leaned forward, resting his clasped hands on his knee, and his voice fell to a low, cutting whisper that carried farther than any shout. "You didn't come back for me," he said. "You came back for money." The entire set went still, as if the world itself had paused to listen. Helena's tears stopped midstream, suspended in disbelief. The studio audience, caught in the gravity of the moment, held their breath like witnesses to something sacred and shattering them at once. The boy she had left behind was gone. In his place sat a man forged from the wreckage she left behind, a man who owed her nothing, not even his anger. What hung in the air was not just pain, but a truth too sharp to ignore. Love cannot be claimed like property when it was never given. It must be chosen, and chosen again, even when it hurts. And when it is betrayed, it leaves scars that no apology can buy back. If this moment struck something deep within you, follow Heart Stories to witness more journeys of justice, healing, and the power to rise from the ashes of abandonment. Long before the bright lights of television and the name Ethan Monroe became a symbol of triumph, there was only a small boy standing barefoot on a cracked wooden porch, watching taillights vanish down a rural road. Helena Ward left in the night without a note, without a backward glance, carrying nothing but a suitcase and the silence that would define his childhood. Ethan was 5, too young to understand abandonment, yet old enough to remember the way the door closed like a final verdict. What remained was Mason Monroe, a man whose hands were calloused from years of laying bricks and whose pockets were almost always empty, suddenly left to raise a son alone while his world crumbled. Mason's life narrowed to the rhythm of survival. At dawn, he walked to the construction site with steel-toed boots slapping wet asphalt. And at dusk, he came home cloaked in the dust of other people's dreams. His eyes carried the dull ache of exhaustion, yet he still knelt on the floor beside Ethan with bleeding knuckles to explain how volcanoes worked. or why the stars seemed to shiver. His voice always softened when he spoke to his son, though the world had made him hard. That tenderness became the only constant Ethan could count on. Helena's absence shaped the household like an invisible wall. When Mason eventually remarried, the new wife filled the kitchen with polished smiles that never reached her eyes. She had a son from a previous marriage and treated him like porcelain while treating Ethan like a tenant who owed rent. He was given the smallest room, the coldest meals, and the longest list of chores. His footsteps became careful, his voice hushed, as though trying not to disturb a home that never felt like his. When she laughed at her own child's jokes but ignored his attempts at conversation, Ethan learned how silence can wound deeper than cruelty. He found scraps of freedom in the dim light of restaurant kitchens, washing dishes until his fingertips cracked, slipping wages into a secret envelope labeled school. He wore the smell of soap and steel on his skin, drifting between exhaustion and determination, never daring to complain. In classrooms, he sat near the back, quiet and watchful, wearing thrift store sweaters and hiding the truth about himself in the folds of his notebooks. He knew he was different, knew the word gay lived inside him like a fragile secret, but he wrapped it in silence because he could not risk losing what little belonging he had left. At night, while the rest of the house slept, Ethan sat cross-legged on the worn carpet, tracing equations by the glow of a dying lamp. Mason would return near midnight, his body trembling from cold, the smell of cement clinging to him like a second skin. Sometimes his hands were split open from hauling stone. Yet he would crouch beside Ethan, eyes heavy but proud, and say, "Show me what you built today." Ethan showed him diagrams of circuits and sketches of machines that might one day build something better than the life they knew. It was in those quiet hours, father and son shoulder to shoulder in the dark, that Ethan decided he would not stay small. He would not let this world name him the boy without a mother. He would outrun the pity in neighbors' eyes, the cruel whispers from classmates, the invisible chains of poverty and shame. He would rise so high no one could touch the wounds she left behind. But beneath his resolve lay something more fragile, the aching hope that success might one day erase the emptiness Helena carved into him. He did not yet know that no amount of achievement could replace love that was never offered, or that healing would demand more than escape. It would demand the courage to face what broke him and choose to become something gentler than what the world had been to him. The studio felt different when the cameras rolled again. The air had sharpened overnight, as if even the walls sensed that the fragile performance of reconciliation could no longer hold. Helena Ward sat at the edge of her chair beneath the unforgiving lights, her makeup drawn like armor, though her fingers trembled as they gripped the fabric of her skirt. She looked smaller now, stripped of the triumphant entrance she had rehearsed. Across from her, Ethan Monroe sat still as stone, the faint rainbow pin on his lapel catching the light each time he shifted his shoulders. He did not look at her. He stared at the studio floor, jaw tight, as though bracing for a storm only he could feel coming. The host announced a surprise guest with the deliberate slowness of someone lowering a blade. The studio doors opened, and Mason Monroe walked in. He moved without hurry, his steps grounded by years of carrying weight that would have crushed softer men. He wore a plain work jacket, the collar frayed from seasons of cold, and the camera caught the faint streak of gray in his hair like a thread of steel. There was no spectacle in his entrance, only a quiet gravity that silenced even the whispering producers. He nodded once toward Ethan, and for the first time since the show began, the young man's posture loosened by a fraction, as though the sight of the man who had held his world together steadied him. Mason stopped at the center of the stage, turning to face Helena with the steady calm of someone who had already survived the worst she could do. His voice was even, but carried the slow-burn weight of truth. He said there had been no violence, no threats, no desperate escape. She had not fled a monster. She had walked away from a man drowning in debt and a boy who reached for her as she closed the door. Mason described the collapse that followed, how the company he worked for folded, how the bills piled higher than his paychecks, how he worked through fevers and broken bones to keep food on the table. Through it all, Helena had not called, not written, not sent even a coin for the son she claimed to love. The words spread across the studio like fire catching dry grass. Gasps rippled from the audience. The host's practiced smile flickering into disbelief. The camera zoomed in on Helena's face, once defiant, now paling under the weight of exposure. Her mouth opened, then closed again, no words finding their way through the wreckage of her defense. Ethan stood then, not to speak for his father, but to stand beside him. It was not a gesture of defiance, but of recognition, a silent declaration that the boy who had once hidden in corners now stood in the open, unashamed. His voice, when it came, was controlled, but raw. He told the truth he had buried for years, that while Helena vanished, he had grown up under the rule of a stepmother who saw him as an intruder, who measured his worth in chores completed and silence maintained. He confessed that he had worked in secret when he was barely 14, slipping out after dinner to scrub restaurant counters until dawn just to pay for his textbooks while pretending he was fine. The audience shifted, eyes darting between the weary father and the son who had carried so much alone. The space between Ethan and Helena was no longer a gap to be bridged, but a chasm carved by her choices. She stared at the stage floor, her lips moving around fragments of apology that never formed, and whispered to no one in particular, "I was young. I was lost." The words sounded hollow even to her own ears, stripped of power now that truth had caught up to her. What hung in the studio was more than judgment. It was the quiet realization that time does not erase what abandonment plants. Silence does not neutralize harm. It only buries it until someone digs it out with bleeding hands. And healing, when it finally comes, begins not with forgiveness demanded, but with truth spoken aloud, no matter how much it scorches the air. The broadcast ended, but the storm Helena Ward had stirred refused to settle. In the aftermath of the televised confrontation, tabloids swarmed her with flashbulbs and speculation. Yet she walked from interview to interview, draped in a new mask of resolve. She spoke of maternal devotion as though it were currency, claiming she had only asked for her share of the old house's compensation, $350,000, not for herself, but to build a future for Ethan. She told reporters she had been saving on her own as well, proudly declaring she had quietly amassed another $300,000 to add to it. The narrative painted her as a misunderstood woman trying to right the past, a mother desperate to finally give instead of take. But Ethan Monroe had lived too long in the shadow of manipulation to mistake sentiment for sincerity. While headlines tried to recast her as repentant, he retreated from the noise, locking himself in the silence of his penthouse office high above the city. The glass walls overlooked the skyline he had conquered. Yet that night he saw only fragments of memory, the boy washing dishes until his knuckles split, the man who raised him coming home broken from another double shift, the sound of Helena's voice now weaponized into theater. She had turned abandonment into performance, regret into leverage. He began to pull at the threads of her claims, methodically, the way he once debugged code line by line. Financial records surfaced through quiet legal channels, revealing something far less noble than sacrifice. Helena had lost the modest apartment she once owned years ago, not to misfortune, but to spiraling gambling debts that left her $200,000 underwater. There were no secret savings, no trust fund blooming unseen. There was only desperation wrapped in sentiment, hope of using his success as a lifeline to drag herself from the ruin she had built. Ethan read the documents in silence, the truth confirming what instinct had already whispered. She had not returned to give him anything. She had returned to take more. It was not anger that spread through him, but a cold clarity. If he gave her what she asked for, it would not be mercy. It would be permission for her to keep turning motherhood into a bargaining chip. And if he let her attach herself to his name now, she would carve away at everything he had fought to build, piece by piece, until nothing belonged to him anymore, not even his own story. So he began to plan. He moved with quiet precision, crafting layers of misdirection around his intentions. He instructed his legal team to prepare documents under seal, to mask transfers under charitable clauses, to draft announcements that would only be released when the timing aligned. He told no one, not even Mason. This was not revenge. It was severance. The final act of cutting loose a ghost that had haunted every success he achieved. Each night he worked late, city lights burning beyond the glass while old wounds hummed in his chest like live wires. He thought of the other children he had met at LGBTQ youth shelters during his early startup years, teenagers sleeping on concrete because their parents called them shame and slammed the door. He thought of the way they stared at him like he was proof that survival was possible. He knew what it meant to claw your way out alone, and he understood now that protecting what you've built sometimes means protecting it even from the people who gave you life. Helena's face appeared across morning talk shows, spinning tales of reconciliation. But Ethan stayed silent. He was not interested in spectacle anymore. He was building something far quieter and far more permanent, a decision that would prove blood is not an unbreakable contract. It is love, not lineage, that earns the right to stand beside someone's future. And if love is absent, it must be chosen, not assumed, not demanded, and never bought with guilt. The second recording day arrived dressed in anticipation. The Family Truth studio had been transformed into something resembling a courtroom, sleek and theatrical, every spotlight waiting to catch the crack of resolution. Producers whispered behind clipboards, sensing the ratings gold they were about to mine from reconciliation turned spectacle. Helena Ward entered like she had already won, her heels striking the polished floor with a rhythm of entitlement. Gone was the trembling woman who once claimed fear. Today her lips carried the glint of victory, her hair swept into perfect symmetry as though preparing for a coronation. She carried herself as if the world owed her applause, certain the cameras would capture her redemption. Ethan Monroe was already on stage, immovable in his charcoal suit, the faint rainbow pin still anchored to his lapel like a vow. He did not rise when she approached, did not offer a smile. He simply watched her with the stillness of someone who had outgrown needing anything from the person before him. The host spoke of closure, of moving forward, voice slick with manufactured hope, while crew members placed a single envelope on the glass table between them. Inside was the object Helena had wrapped her comeback around, the check for $350,000, the compensation for the house she had abandoned along with her son. Helena reached for it with a laugh that rang too brightly, a laugh rehearsed for headlines. The studio leaned forward to witness the climax of her redemption arc. But Ethan's voice cut clean through the hum of expectation, sharp as winter air. He told her she would not be receiving that money. A ripple of confusion swept across the audience, cameras tilting closer. Helena froze, her fingers hovering above the envelope as though touching it might burn her. Ethan rose, and his words unfolded with a calm that made them undeniable. He announced that the full amount had been transferred into a new scholarship fund for LGBTQ youth who had been cast out by their parents' children, who slept in shelters, who had been told they were shame, who had no one to stand for them. The fund bore a name now engraved in legal ink, the Helena Ward Scholarship for Abandoned Youth. A portrait of her would hang in the foundation's lobby, not as a celebration, but as a reminder. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Then the silence shattered under Helena's gasp, sharp and disbelieving. Color drained from her face like water leaving cracked stone. She stammered, voice climbing toward hysteria, declaring it was her money, her right, her share of the past. But Ethan stood anchored in the storm she could not summon. "No," he said, steady, final. "You gave up the right to claim me or anything tied to me the day you left." She faltered back as flashbulbs exploded from the press pit, the perfect mask she had worn collapsing in fragments at her feet. Security ushered her from the stage, her protest drowned by the roar of cameras capturing the death of her performance. Outside, her name would now belong to a cause she had never chosen, stitched permanently to the children she had once turned away from. When the studio cleared, Ethan walked out beside Mason Monroe into the dusk air. They drove past glass towers to a modest community hall where a crowd waited beneath strings of soft light. It was the first award ceremony of the foundation. On stage, a quiet boy in an oversized jacket received the inaugural scholarship check, his hands shaking as he accepted it. His eyes glimmered with a fragile kind of hope Ethan remembered carrying like a secret fire. Mason placed a hand on his son's shoulder as the applause rose. Ethan stood straight in his tailored vest, the rainbow pin glowing under the lights, and whispered, more to himself than anyone, blood can make you related, but only love and the choice to stay can make you family. If you were Ethan, would you have done the same? Follow Heart Stories for more journeys of justice, resilience, and the love that rebuilds what abandonment tried to destroy.